Well, good morning. It is certainly glad that everyone can join in and find a way to stay connected with each other. Find a way to stay involved with each other. And these mornings of worship together, even virtually, is a good way to do that. So we're really glad that you've tuned in for that. And y'all, I will tell you, as we've seen all the events of the past 2 or 3 weeks evolve, a lot of distraction has come to pass. A lot of despair, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. A lot of things have happened that, for some, have honestly shaken their faith, and that's understandable. There are things happening that some of us have never seen before, circumstances that we're just not familiar with, and so it's understandable that we would have some feelings of fear and that kind of thing. But I want to talk about this morning for a few minutes something that we have already kind of dealt with a little bit as we've begun our worship. I want to talk about when Moses went up on the mountain to receive the law, and he had this moment in time with God, personally with God, and how awesome it must have been to be able to have this one-on-one moment with God. And if you remember, when he came down from the mountain, his countenance was different. His face shone like light, and people were scared. And can you imagine having this experience when God himself descended on the mountain and you were in his presence? That must have been an amazing thing that happened there. And even as Moses was leading the children of Israel through the wilderness, when things got bad, Moses would cry out to God and extol it and just say, "Look, God, we know you are powerful. We know you can. We know you are." And God took care of every need they had. We have people like David, as Mark just read one of the Psalms. When David, in many of the Psalms that he wrote, and in many of the Psalms that were written by some of the other musicians, they talk about God and his majesty and his power and his sovereignty. And that is a major theme in many of the Psalms, just recognizing who God is and recognizing his power and his position. And so as we look at those kind of things, we see other examples like Elijah in 1 Kings 18. Can you imagine the scene on Mount Carmel when Elijah was there with the prophets of Baal and they were hooting and hollering and jumping up and down and cutting themselves and acting all crazy, and nothing ever happened because Baal is just not a god. But if you remember Elijah's prayer, it was the prayer of confidence and recognizing that God has the power to do whatever he wants. And Elijah said, "Just come down here and show these people. Just show these people who you are." And God did. And just seeing that had to be one of those things. I would like to have been just a spectator at that event, just standing back watching this transpire, because Elijah prayed this prayer with such confidence. And as we look at this, we realize that each one of these people, Moses had a relationship with God. David, called a man after God's own heart. David had a relationship with God. Elijah was a prophet of God. You even go to Abraham and some of the conversations he had with God, and you just realize that these people were connected to God. And so you would recognize and realize that they would believe in God and believe in his power and believe how wonderful and how strong he is, because they already have a relationship with God. But what I want us to look at for a few minutes today, to remind us of how wonderful God is the reaction of some of the people who did not have a relationship with God and really didn't know that much about Him because they didn't have this personal connection with Him. So we're going to start in Joshua chapter 2, which is a very familiar passage to many of us. But Joshua has sent a couple of spies into Jericho, and they are spying out the land, and they have come to the house of Rahab, and she's hiding them on the roof. And if you look in Joshua 2, beginning in verse 8, it says, "Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, 'I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you.' And listen close to this now. 'For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath.'" Now think about who's saying this. This is not a follower of God. This is a pagan woman living in a pagan town with a bunch of heathens and idol worshipers, and she says, "Look, we are scared to death because of you, because we recognize your God as the God of heaven and the God of earth." I mean, and that's someone who doesn't even know God. And they have this realization, this recognition of the power and the majesty of this Creator. And I look at that and I think, wow, this is someone who doesn't even know God. And they understand. Another one of my favorite examples of this is over in Daniel. Let's look over in Daniel at Daniel chapter 3. If you remember what's going on in Daniel, the children of Israel are in exile in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is the king. He has set up an obelisk for them to worship. He's made this monument, and he says, when you hear the sound of the music, everyone falls down to worship. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, "Well, not us." And the king said, "Oh, yes, you are." And they said, "Oh, no, we're not." And they didn't. And so Nebuchadnezzar was furious. And he threw these three young boys into the fiery furnace. And they looked in, and not only were the three men still alive, there was a fourth in there with them. And it says the fourth was like the form of the Son of God. Now, I have no idea what that looked like. I can't even begin to speculate what it would say. The form of the fourth is like the Son of God. And it doesn't matter what that form looked like. What matters is that these three young boys had a relationship with their God who protected them in this furnace. And not only did He protect them in the furnace, He brought them out. So listen to this. This is in Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 28. After they were brought out, and not only were they okay, they didn't even smell like smoke. So Nebuchadnezzar, and remember now, Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and Babylon is not a God-fearing bunch of people. And Nebuchadnezzar is certainly not a God-fearing king. So listen to what he says, beginning in verse 28. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent His angel and delivered His servants who trusted in Him, and they have frustrated the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." You get that? This is a pagan king who does not believe in God, and yet he witnesses this power and he witnesses this control over the elements, and he witnesses the fact that now he realizes that there is a power greater than himself, and he says there is no other God like that God. This is a pagan that recognizes the power and the majesty of God. If you look over a little further, also still in Daniel, we have now Darius is the king, and the Medes and the Persians are in charge now, and Darius the Mede is the king, and he gets tricked into making this decree that no one should pray except to him, and then Daniel prays facing Jerusalem, and then all this mess comes up, and the guys come back and say, well, king, you said. And so the king had to follow through his orders, and he commanded that Daniel be cast into the lion's den. Then if you know how the story goes, the angel came and shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel was saved, and the next day the king came running into the den, and he called up to Daniel, and Daniel said, I'm here, king, I'm fine. And so Daniel was brought out, and the king then says, now instead of Daniel being destroyed in the lion's den, I'm going to throw in these guys who tricked me and their families, and it says that for them, they were crushed before they ever even hit the ground. I feel like God had a hand in that. I feel like God was in control of that as well. So listen to what King Darius wrote. This is in Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 25. To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. I'm just going to take a moment, and I want to read this decree one more time, and I want you to listen very, very closely to these words. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. We'll try to read the rest of that verse. For he is the living God. He's steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Folks, the God who is our Father, the God who delivers, the God who rescues, the God who is in control of all of this, y'all, even the pagans recognize his power. Should we not have so much more recognition and understanding of the power of our God? Amen. He is in control. So we don't need to rely on mainstream media. We don't need to rely on the politicians. We don't need to rely on the CDC or the World Health Organization or anybody else, church, because our God is the living God and steadfast forever. Amen. And his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Amen. Y'all, I read that and it brings so much comfort and so much peace knowing that that is our Father. And listen, folks, even if we died today, God is still steadfast, and His kingdom will still endure forever, and He will never leave us or never forsake us. You know, we don't have to fear because our God is the one true living God.
Amen.
Y'all, over in the book of Jonah, the account over there, that's another one that I look at, and I see this example of how this played out again. Jonah has been told to go to the city of Nineveh, which is an Assyrian city, one of the biggest cities in the world at the time. And if you don't know that much about Nineveh, it was a brutal, sadistic kingdom. If they took prisoners, they were horribly treated. They were idolaters, they were pagans, they worshiped false gods. They were just a horrible group of people in that respect. And yet God, in verse 2 of Jonah, says, chapter 1, it says, "Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah didn't want to go, and so there was a big storm. The ship was about to break up. And listen to verse 5. "Then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God." You notice that? Everybody on the boat cried out to their own God. Whatever God that was that they were trusting in, they cried out to their own God and threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. But Jonah had gone down to the lowest parts of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said, "What do you mean, sleeper? Arise and call on your God, and perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish." Notice that? They're saying, look, our gods are useless. Our gods are doing nothing. Give yours a try. Wouldn't it be great if everybody in the world would recognize that all the false gods are useless, and we say, we'd like to try yours. We would really love to try a relationship with your God, because ours are useless. So as we know, they threw him overboard, and the sea calmed. The Lord had prepared a great fish for Jonah to be swallowed by. Jonah came to his senses, went to Nineveh, and spent time there talking to the people of Nineveh. So beginning in verse 5 of chapter 3 of Jonah. "So the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. And then word came to the king of Nineveh. And he arose from his throne and laid aside his robe, covered himself with sackcloth and ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published throughout Nineveh by decree of the king and his nobles, saying, Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth and cry mightily to God. Yes, let everyone turn from his evil way and the violence that is in his hands. And who can tell if God will turn and relent and turn away from his fierce anger so that we may not perish?" Y'all, here is the king of one of the most powerful cities at the time. And when he hears the words of Jonah, he believes in this God that Jonah is talking about. And he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he says, let's stop being mean. Let's stop our evil. Let's stop our violence. And let's turn and let's fast and let's hope that God relents from this destruction. You know, an arrogant, prideful person would not have done that. So it's clear that he recognized the power and the majesty and the sovereignty of God. So as we look at these examples of these pagans that really had no firsthand knowledge of God, and yet they're able to see and to turn and to say, I realize now, I have witnessed the power of this God, and I realize now that He is the one true God. And so we've got to straighten up. God, I see these examples, and I think of all the people in the world, folks, we should be the ones that understand the power and the sovereignty of God. Amen. We have seen firsthand the effect that He has on people. We have experienced firsthand the effect He's had on us individually. And so when we see these examples of people who didn't believe and then came to realize, wow, this God really is God. No, we shouldn't have to convince each other. God's in control. God's got this taken care of. God is going to handle all this. God is in control. We should not have to convince ourselves of that, because we should have a clear understanding, knowing who God is, knowing His power, knowing that He is in control. We shouldn't have to wonder. We shouldn't have to worry. We should just know that this God that we serve is steadfast, and His kingdom endures forever. Amen. Now, we won't be here on earth forever. That was never part of the plan. That's not our ultimate goal, is it, to be on earth forever. Our ultimate goal is to be in God's presence forever. To be at the foot of His throne forever. To be with Him in glory forever. So our encouragement today, what I want to encourage us to think about today and remember, is that this is the God that we know. This is the God who is our Father. This is the God who loves us so much that He gave His own Son to die for each one of us, individually and collectively. This is the God who has bridged the gap between Himself and us, the gap that we created with our sin. He's bridged that gap with His Son. And He pursues us day after day, desiring a relationship with us, not only here, but for eternity. Folks, we should be the ones who recognize that better than anyone else. And yet we see these examples from the Scripture of these folks who had an experience with God and came to realize this is the one true and living God, the God of heaven and the God of earth. Amen. Now we have opportunity every day to have an experience with God, to experience God, to be in His presence every single day. So shouldn't that give us a clear understanding of who He is and His power and what His plan is for each of us? God bless you. Have a good day.